You're listening to Two Beers Until Phronesis, a philosophy podcast for students, graduates, and anyone else interested in ideas. In this side series, we explore the history of philosophy and its most notable thinkers, from Socrates to Nietzsche, covering all the big ideas from the ground up. Enjoy!
You recording?
Yes, I'm recording.
So I've returned. You've brought me back to your dungeon.
The cave.
After months of not doing the podcast. You lured me in with pizza, so you had some pizza, and then I went, I'll go into the house. Then they're like, boom, doing a Plato podcast, and you trapped me. Now we're doing Plato. So
yeah, well, we did try this a while back, and I think we've kind of realised in this series, like now we've moved on to Plato, who's the first guy to write things down. It's like, okay, we need to actually change tact a little bit here, and we've decided to split this episode up because Plato talks a lot, Plato writes a lot, and it's difficult to unpack lots of his ideas. So we're going to go through it as thoroughly as possible, I think.
Right, so this first one is going to be early dialogues, and just to give you an idea of the early history of Plato, who he is, where he comes from, why is he such a big deal, I guess, or partly why he's such a big deal, and we'll get on to more of the meat of his ideas in a later episode. But yeah, shall we launch into a sort of overview of who this guy was?
Yeah.
And why you've probably, if you've never heard of philosophy, you may well still have heard of Plato, heard his name, if not at school, then in popular culture, being one of the most influential philosophers in the West, probably one of the largest catalogues of Western philosophy from that ancient Greek period, or at least one of the first ones. And as such becomes the basis of much of our knowledge on Socrates, many pre-Socratics, and also many figures and politicians at the time who do have a part in Plato's writings. And we'll get on to why that is. And
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things to say is that Plato's always been read throughout history. He's gone through sort of fading popularity, especially with Christianity. There's like a few periods and times where a lot of his work was missing or lost or kind of not favoured particularly well, especially compared to his student Aristotle. But generally, people have always read Plato, and certain people have always loved Plato. So yeah, hopefully at the end of these, we might do 3 episodes, we might do more, we might do less, but hopefully at the end of this discussion on Plato, you'll hear some of our opinions on Plato, but mostly I'm hoping to just like get out a sense of, well, who was he? Who was the actual bloke? And what can we know about him? And why was he so important? And I guess we can start then with the context of why he was even writing and the context, I guess, of the ancient Athens. And
right.
Ancient
So,
Greece.
I mean, this was a guy born, back in the 5th century BC. He was born in 427 BC, which was basically a few years into the Peloponnesian War. And he was the son of his father called Ariston and a mother called...
Was he really the son of his father?
Yes. But perhaps not. Maybe I should make an addendum there. And he had 2 brothers and a sister. And he grew up receiving a musical, philosophical, and gymnastic education. And he liked to write lots of sort of juvenile epigrams and tragedies.
Lyrical, tragic poetry and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. But none of that really survived, unfortunately, or very little of it has, if any did. He was apparently quite handsome. And the name I've heard, I don't know how true this is, the name Plato he was named after for the width of his shoulders, apparently. He had pretty damn broad shoulders.
Yeah, he's a wide boy.
Yeah, and he had he twice won prizes at the Isthmian Games, which is like a festival of athletic and musical competitions in honor of the sea god Poseidon, which is sort of held on like the 2nd and 4th years of each Olympiad. And
the name Plato, that's almost definitely to do with wrestling, but obviously the broadness could also be either his head. Apparently his head was pretty broad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, or it could have been like the broadness of his ideas. But yeah, probably because he was into wrestling. And I think that like competitiveness and an interest in other things that aren't just sitting on chaise longues and talking about philosophy is going to come back into it as well.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think that's why it's important to set that up as well.
Yeah, and also sort of around this period when he was growing up, he also aspired to be a playwright. So he was originally on track to, write these tragedies and comedies and, be a writer in a more general sense.
Yeah, he would have been pushed into politics. And I think there were certain things going on in politics very young in his life. Even then, he would have been critical of. He wouldn't. I think from what we know, he would have been sort of pressured into politics, and he was more of like the artsy, like I'm going to do this bollocks and run off with Socrates and do things.
Yeah.
But
speaking of which, it was pretty much after he met Socrates, which was somewhere around 407 BC when he was around 20 years old, that he totally quit his sports and he burned his writings of like all his tragedies and whatever, and just decided to take up philosophy and got really inspired by this enigmatic Socrates character who we discussed in an earlier episode. I mean, so we could talk about a bit where Socrates sort of was at this time, or at least I mean, Socrates at this time, as we sort of covered in the previous episode, was this figure that was supposedly sort of corrupting the youth and taking on loads of pupils and students. And Plato happened to be one of those sort of students, and he had such a profound impact on Plato himself that Plato's writings therefore would pretty much, at least the Socratic writings, would almost always feature Socrates as a main character in them.
So I think, if this is like a story, Socrates' death and trial would be the inciting incident for Plato. I don't know how much of an impact it really had. I don't know if it was like the thing that spurred Plato to do a lot of his writing, but it seems to have had a very profound, dramatic impact on him. Like really shook his life up in a big way.
I would say he certainly seems like the kind of character, judging by his past in writing, he seems like someone who would have written anyway. The difference is, I think, that he, knowing Socrates and getting that philosophical education, and then also the trial of Socrates and everything that happened there and the critiques that brought of the Athenian state and the political climate at the time, sort of inspired his writing to turn into these sort of philosophical dialogues which critique much of whether it's politics or philosophy, or just literally there to try and uphold some of the ideals that Socrates had, or project some of his ideas about metaphysics or ontology into the world through dramatization.
Yeah. So this was 399 BC when Socrates was put to death. Apparently, Plato himself he writes in one of his dialogues later that Plato was ill during the actual trial. But basically, him and Socrates had spoken out against the 30 tyrants. They'd been criticizing it. And then democracy had been restored in Athens. And it was democracy that actually put Socrates to death.
Right, so this is not that long after the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War, which did not turn out well for Athens. And then in that sort of aftermath, you've got these 30 tyrants, these like historical figures where Athens was in this sort of push and pull between becoming a democratic state and becoming a sort of oligarchical state. And eventually these sort of 30 tyrants, sort of inspired somewhat by sort of creating a bastardized version of the Spartan way of organizing their rulers, kind of created this oligarchical structure in which they tried to have, their detractors murdered off, and basically things did not go very well for democracy during those times. And I mean, Plato's own family and lots of his associates were associated with these 30 tyrants as well. So he did have a lot of close ties to these things.
The 30 tyrants during that regime, they actually asked Plato to sort of come and work for them and get involved in politics. That was a large part of where that sort of aristocratic pressure was coming from. But yeah, he rejected it because he fucking hates tyranny. But then, when the democracy is restored, they're also trying to clean house and get rid of detractors. And I think they were very eager to sort of push Socrates under the rug for some of the sort of outlandish things he was saying, going against the status quo. And I think this is this is a central theme to a lot of what Plato wants to say. It's not that he hates freedom. It's not that he hates democracy. It's like, because I think that's very strange. Like this very prolific thinker actually hating democracy. But I think it's to do with exactly what democracy meant back then. Something slightly different to how we think of democracy today. And it's not so much that he doesn't like it. He thought more that people weren't ready for it. And he saw that firsthand with the death of Socrates. He thought that was a very poor choice. He thought that was people abusing their choice. Which is why he's going to have such a strong idea of education. He thinks people need to be educated before they can make choices. And it's why he's very bitter in one sense. I get the sense he's bitter anyway. And I think a lot of scholars kind of go with that approach. They sort of go, "Oh, he's the he's not necessarily an angry philosopher because of this, but he is very keen to sort of challenge doxa. That's like everyday, ordinary, accepted opinions that are just sort of,
which would have come a lot from the inspiration of Socrates, which we've talked about before, of that sort of idea of deconstructing someone until they either have to give up the fact that they don't know what they're talking about or redefine what they believe. Well, so after this, the trial of Socrates is again like 399 BC. Plato, feeling not particularly good about Athens at the time, went traveling, and we're not entirely sure where he traveled to. A lot of stuff I read, they say he went to Egypt after this.
Yeah, so maybe Egypt, probably Italy.
Yeah, well, Italy was almost definitely later, but again, we're not 100% sure if he did. But in this first period of traveling, there was perhaps Italy, perhaps Egypt. Again, we're not really sure, but the point is he sort of went on his soul-searching journey.
Yeah, I like to imagine he skipped a lot of stones, looking into the Mediterranean Sea and just like looking at his reflection, going, "Who am I?"
Yeah,
did a very long gap here. Yeah, so
it was about a 12-year long gap here. Yeah, and during this period, he wrote what we are going to be focusing on in this episode, which is what is normally grouped into his what I call his early dialogues. So let's talk a little bit about dialogues and what they are, and sort of essentially what we mean when we say a dialogue instead of just like a book or or a story or just a work. The reason why we say dialogue is because Plato was kind of like, he innovated this form called the dialogue, in which you have multiple characters all just engaged in conversation about particular topics or whatever.
Yeah.
And he uses this as a device, sort of almost through this narrative of this conversation or whatever, to bring forward questions about philosophy, about politics, about pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And that's how he sort of got through and discussed his ideas.
Well, it's basically a chat, often a drunk chat between elites and generals and friends and experts on certain subjects. And a lot of the time, it's kind of out of time. It would be a bit like if somebody wrote a story today with like Quentin Tarantino, Greta Thunberg, and Margaret Thatcher all having a chat. A lot of the time, it's like ancient Greek crossover fan fiction.
They're fictional dialogues, but the point is that they were often casting real people.
Yeah, and they were written to an audience that would have known who these people were. So, and that's kind of part of the context that's sometimes difficult for, I guess, like students to get, because you kind of have to know who these people were to get in on a lot of the jokes, because they are meant to be funny, they are meant to be entertaining. I think that's a large part of what Plato wanted. He wants to actually actively change the world, have an effect on it, and I think the dialogues are a way of doing that.
Right. And I think a lot of that comes from his, as I've talked about before, his history as a playwright, where he started off. Like, had he not necessarily had that strong sort of narratives sense in him, he may have written in a different style, or may not have been quite so keen on like innovating the dialogue style in the way that he did. Or perhaps even been more direct in addressing his ideas.
I think it comes from Socrates as well, because if people remember when we were talking about Socrates, we said he never wrote anything down. And I think the reason for that is because he thought philosophy was something that has to be spoken about. He wasn't interested in having a legacy, but he also felt that, from what we can infer, Socrates didn't really want to write anything down because he thought that was kind of like stagnant. It was the death of philosophy. It was too instructive. And what Plato wants to do is sort of tease the answers out of the reader.
Right.
In that sort of Socratic way.
A dialogue form can, in essence, start to get closer to what a dialectic would actually be like, in the sense that you can have it not only sort of mix myths and philosophy together and use story, but you can also adapt itself to the individual who's reading it, and it can respond to queries in a way that a book just stating facts cannot. Like, you can have another character that is skeptical of a particular view that you've done, and you can have this sort of very organic way in which the characters trade these ideas and analyze them in a way that you won't necessarily get in a more straightforward sort of non-narrative style. Most of these are sort of debates, and the point is that, as you said, Socrates believed that this sort of dialectic debating style was where philosophy was, really born and really properly criticized, and where ideas could really be figured out. And so the dialectics were kind of a way to try and get closer to that in writing. It also meant you could do stuff like repeat arguments. And one thing that's common in dialogues is sometimes things will be repeated over and over again, which you wouldn't normally see in a modern form of writing that wouldn't do that. You can have it could almost be like a real conversation where we say things, especially me, I will say things over and over again sometimes without necessarily realizing it. And dialogues can sort of do that for you.
Yeah, I think Plato would have really liked podcasts, come to think of it. But yeah, no, he likes all opinions sort of being covered. But it's sort of not just about presenting a balanced argument. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more to do with method. And the method that Socrates would have used, the Socratic method that we talked about in the past, this sort of line of questioning that's getting to the truth by exploring almost what's already implicitly known. So you'll be like, you have Socrates as the main character, always questioning people and saying like, well, do you accept this? And they'll go, yes. And they'll say, well, do you also accept this example? And they go, yes. And then you'll sort of cross-reference them like some kind of lawyer and go, well, if you accept that and that, then surely that follows. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like, yes, I do.
Yeah.
Of course, Socrates. Yes, Socrates. There's a lot of that going on.
And it probably would have been a little bit less, friendly with Socrates a lot of the time. I think, he's obviously held up in in these sorts of dialogues. But it would have been pretty annoying to have been on the receiving end of Socrates going about your day.
There's a historical, romanticized, almost nostalgic concept to what these dialogues were trying to do, because I think they harken back to an age, obviously when Socrates was actually alive, but also a time when these conversations were possibly held more frequently in less turbulent times. So I think that's part of the appeal in the context of when people were reading them. So yeah, a lot of the time it is probably a little bit more civil than it would have been. But ideally, this Socratic method is supposed to be a collaborative effort. It's not like a debate in the modern sense where people are going, no, I'm right and I want to prove I'm right. Both people are both trying to reach the truth together by sort of playing devil's advocate to each other. And that's really important.
Right. And also it allows Plato to remove himself directly. Well, obviously, it's been interpreted what are perhaps Plato putting his views into these dialogues through other characters being spoken out through other characters. In a superficial sense, there is no direct Plato is telling you what he thinks about this particular thing. A lot of it will take place through a dialogue, and it's ambiguous necessarily what is something being espoused as Plato's, what Plato thinks, or necessarily what Socrates thinks, or what a character in this fictional dialogue would actually think, whether or not they really would. And so that's another big part of the dialogues, that he can sort of remove himself from it to a certain extent. But fundamentally, I think one of the reasons why they've survived so well and why so many people do study them and read them is because they are dramatized like this. They are much easier to read. They're fun to read. They're a lot less dense to read. When you've got characters describing things to each other or arguing with each other, that drama does create an environment where you remember that more of a dynamic, and you learn with these characters.
Yeah, I'd see when I studied this fucking years ago, a lot of people seem to not like a lot of these dialogues because they felt that it was very detached. They felt like Plato's own voice wasn't really in it. And also, there is an indirectness in the sense that often, even when Socrates is putting forward ideas, they're usually being affirmed by other people. So he's not saying anything like, oh, look, I really, really believe this very strongly and you have to agree with me. It's usually just like, here's an idea. And then everyone else goes, good idea. It's not like anyone's particularly passionate in a very obvious sense a lot of the time.
Although we will say most, and we'll get into a sort of bit of the trend of these dialogues, but in many cases, Socrates' approach isn't to necessarily present an idea, at least not at first. If he does, it'll normally be way later on, after he sort of exposed the ignorance or exposed the fact that the person his interlocutor in these discussions is not necessarily as knowledgeable about the thing that they claim to understand as they truly are. So to sort of give you an idea to start to move into the idea of these actual writings. I mean, Plato's wrote, we think, around 35 dialogues, maybe about 13 letters. They're all sort of grouped together. They're called epistles.
At least 27 of the dialogues are, I would say, around 27 are definitely his, almost no question.
Yeah.
And then, it's somewhere up to 30.
Yeah, I had up to about 41 could potentially be. But like, 41 is like the way overestimate, where some of it's almost definitely not Plato. The middle ground I'd normally see around the mid 30s is normally where I see.
Yeah, that is what
works
most
that most people probably think is Plato. But yeah, like fewer works than that we know are like almost definitely this was something by Plato.
Yeah, I just want to say it's also very unique for somebody to write entirely in dialogues. Like, people didn't really do this at the time, and they haven't really done since. But the big ones you will have heard of are the Symposium, the Apology, perhaps. The Republic is a very big one.
Well, I mean, the Apology is normally grouped into the Trial or something. You'll normally see stuff like what's called the Apology, and another one called Crito, and normally grouped into the Trial, or like something to do with Socrates' Trial is normally how it's rebranded these days, because it's easier to sort of package them, which again are the books that directly address the end of Socrates' life.
You see them in compilations quite a lot.
Yeah, and like I said, Republic is the work that if you know one work from Plato, people will probably reference the Republic as being his biggest work, and also the one that probably has the most of his ideas in. But for this particular episode, before we get to the Republic, which we'll do in a later episode because it's such a massive one to do anything, what we're going to do is talk about this first 12-year period when he went travelling and wrote his first sort of period of works, or at least we believe that these all sort of fit into their first period. It's also worth just talking about how we separate these into periods. Why do we think that why do we have a sort of early, middle, late? Why isn't it just, there's like a chronological order?
Yeah, part of it is thematic, to do with what Socrates is actually doing in these dialogues and what Plato is using him for. What kind of character is he? Is he closer to the more truthful historical account of what we can infer Socrates was actually like, or is he just a character that Plato is using to espouse some of his own ideas? Is he talking about the types of things that Socrates probably would have talked about, or is he talking about more aloof ideas? Is he coming up with big theses about the universe, or is he just annoying people like he probably was more likely to do? That's part of it, and I think it's also there is like the chronological argument as well, as when he was actually writing these things, at what stage in his life was it? Because we know the Laws was pretty late. We know that the Apology was relatively early. But yeah, a lot of this is just to help us get a handle on some kind of order, some kind of categorization. There's a lot of room for debate, a lot of room for error. It's always being revised. There's always scholars
some of the ways in which we try to guess the chronology of these texts, or at least try to place them roughly into a sort of time period. One of the ways is actually stylometry, which is essentially if you know people who try to detect like fake paintings or something, it's the same sort of idea where you look at like the very specific qualities of the writing or the way it's written and things, and you try to group that into other texts that have that similar way it's written or similar trends in the writing. Another one is the obvious ones is just references to other ideas. So if a text references something from an earlier time, we know that comes after that particular text, or an idea, or it talks about something coming up, then we can get an idea of that this text of where it was sort of placed in the body of work. And we have hints based on how these texts were sort of historically grouped together and hand copied. I mean, one of the main sources we have, in the name that often comes up in these things, is a guy called Diogenes Laertius, who was a sort of major source on Greek philosophers from the medieval period, who's one of our few middlemen connections to that ancient period. And often when we have to like figure out how these texts were packaged, which in Plato's case were often grouped into fours in antiquity, and a lot of the reason why that was because Greek plays would often be grouped into three tragedies and a comedy, and so in a similar fashion, Plato's works were grouped into these fours, and that's just part of the sort of style of how certain texts were passed on and copied, and so that can give us evidence of how what texts are kind of part and parcel of each other, and so essentially come to the modern day, yes, there's no like universal agreement on like a chronology. It's almost impossible to tell exactly, for the most part, where exactly a text came or when it was written. We can guess, based on all these criteria, roughly what period in Plato's life did he write these texts. And like I said, we're going to start with what's called the early period. And this is what he wrote post-trial, so 399 BC, down to around 390 BC. So this sort of 8-9 year period.
There is actually a debate that he might have even written some dialogues while Socrates was alive, but that's almost definitely not true. But
well, we don't really know. It could be the case. I mean, most people just take it to be, obviously this, like you said, the inciting incident of Plato's life, which encouraged him to go off and write and have his introspective moments.
Yeah, certainly more romantic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice idea that, yes, he ran away from Athens and wrote this first early period of dialogues.
These early dialogues include things like the Apology, Crito, Euthyphro, which books you might have heard of. And they're seemingly more grounded in kind of, like I said, truth. And it's probably a more accurate portrayal of Socrates. I think what he wanted to do was sort of typecast Socrates as this kind of wise figure, really cement his legacy and do right by him after he died. And again, this wouldn't have been too exaggerated because people knew, like people were reading this and they would have known Socrates. So I doubt it would have been just a complete fucking lie, because a lot of these early conversations are likely to be conversations or versions of conversations that would have taken place. So if you'd have just completely made everything up, it would have been like, well, we were there. We know what really happened. Socrates ran away crying.
Right.
Or whatever.
Well, I mean, there's obviously other writers and historians who did write about the trial and wrote about Socrates, these sorts of things. So we have other sources, and we mentioned them a little bit in the Socrates episode. But the point is that, yes, there are some references here where we can cross-references with other works or other evidence at the time to tell how much of this was accurate. And yeah, so the Apology in Crito, as you just mentioned, the Apology was most of what we covered last time, which is to do with Socrates making a great big speech at his trial. And Crito is one of the friends of Socrates. And this work is simply about the sort of period after when he's been sentenced to death, and it's Crito himself, as we talk about, going and talking to Socrates at the end of his life. Yeah,
usually the name is a clue. So normally the name is the main person Socrates is talking to in that dialogue. So in this one, it's Crito. And Crito tries to get Socrates to leave and escape with him before he's executed. So the trial's just happened, and he's like, he bribes the guard, he comes in and he says, right, come on, let's run away. I can bribe a load of people. We've got a bunch of people waiting outside. We can get you out of here. Of course, Socrates wants to have a long conversation about justice instead.
Yeah.
And he's not interested. And he's being his usual self. He's being ironic. He's being kind of annoying. And Crito basically gives him a bunch of arguments. Basically says, come on, do right by your sons. Think about your sons. You've got a duty to everyone to basically be alive. You're going to make us look like mugs if we don't get you out, because now we've done all this bribing or whatever. And I think of principal importance is the idea that Socrates has been wronged. He doesn't deserve to be here. And then Socrates is like, right, well, I'm going to respond to that, but you're going to have to let me sort of unpack all my ideas, and you say sort of yes or no. You do the dialectic stuff. Do you agree with this proposition? Do you agree with that? So he says things like, what most people think isn't the case. That sort of argumentum ad populum thing of like, just because lots of people agree with something doesn't mean that it's right. So, for example, if you had an athlete, who would he be more likely to listen to when it comes to his health? Would it be a physician or would it be his fans? Obviously, it'd be the physician, Crito says. So things like that. And he basically ends up through this Socratic method, very classic Socrates, and he basically just says, I'd rather stay here because essentially two wrongs don't make a right. I don't really want to. Again, it's this conversation about justice, and this is like a very central
just
theme.
because he was wrong doesn't mean he should violate his own principles, or in his case, he was certainly sort of accepting death, and there is a certain you do wonder to a certain extent if a large part of it was him being aware that towards the end of his life he could make a sort of statement out of himself by going through with you do wonder, because I mean, obviously it has become one of the most famous trials in all of history. So
yeah, it's like, well, I think we were discussing last time, was it stubbornness, or was it this sort of superb moral courage, or was it something else?
Yeah, was it some four-dimensional chess he was playing to be in the history books? Who knows? But
it doesn't seem likely, because again, he never wrote anything. So maybe he just regretted that at the last moment. But anyway, that's pure speculation,
right? Yeah, and so those two works, most of them we did cover already, and then another one of Plato's works, which is one that you've read more than me. I think you've did this one at university, is Euthyphro.
Yes,
which is what's called, I'm going to use a kind of cool word that I learned recently here, as anatreptic. And anatreptic means that it's essentially inconclusive, that it doesn't actually give you a conclusion to what the question that is posed, sort of, or like what the theme of the thing is about. And so what is that theme, Connor?
I've got aporia as that word. So if a conversation ends in aporia, it's kind of like a very classical philosophical.
Is aporia like the Greek word for?
Yes, I believe so. So I don't think
because I think anatreptic is the English word for So that's interesting. So aporia for.
So Euthyphro. So one theme about these early dialogues is that, unlike some of the later stuff we'll see, they are very much specific to a very certain kind of virtue. Again, he sort of teases this unification of virtues, the idea of the good, of some innate, universal concepts, but really they're just conversations, very, very small conversations about one specific thing. And in this case, that specific virtue, that specific quality that he wants to talk about, and he's usually talking to experts or self-professed experts in these qualities. He wants to talk about, in this one, piety. And I guess justice as well, but it's sort of piety and goodness and justice and how they.
Before we go any further, one thing I want to do is talk about what virtue actually means in a Greek context, because this is something that's like obviously
that's a good idea.
Yeah, because even if you know what virtue is, what we say when we say virtue in the context of Plato, particularly in these dialogues, is actually sort of a placeholder or a translation of this word arete, which is probably more broadly described as like an excellence or a competence, like a skill or bravery, or the ability to like achieve one's like highest potential. That sort of thing. It's an embodiment of the best that somebody can be. And that's kind of what they're talking, more accurately what they're talking about when they say virtue, is like this embodiment of this higher potential. And things like the good, again, sort of the way we translate that that's a very dodgy translation of what was a much more sort of abstract thing that you can sort of infer from context in these writings. But what they're normally sort of getting at is this sort of higher idea, this almost pure metaphysical idea of the good, like in almost a theistic sense that we have today. But back then it wasn't. It was almost this purely metaphysical idea.
Yeah, immaterialism is going to come in a lot later. That's sort of the idea of like something transcendent, something above material experience. This is kind of Plato's thing anyway, much more than his student Aristotle, who we're going to get onto at a much later date. But so this is often why Plato has been seen as kind of a poster boy of Christianity, and is sort of known for exploring more.
Funnily enough, both sometimes a poster boy of Christianity and sometimes really hated by Christianity.
Yes,
depending on the the decade.
That's why I said sometimes. It's like sometimes Christians just fucking despise.
Depending on which idea you need to get right for you to work with your religion, sort of thing.
Well, yeah. So in these early dialogues, he's less concerned about that, but it is still there, and I guess that's something to note. Like, the theme of early, middle, late isn't as cut and dry. There are obviously a lot of, we're going to see here, like there's a lot of theological ideas, even this early on in his dialogues. So this particular dialogue, he's talking to a guy called Euthyphro, and it takes place just before Socrates' trial, but it was probably written after the Apology and Crito and all those. So Euthyphro is sort of hanging around this court because he's about to dob in his father for murder, because one of his father's workers killed one of his slaves, if I remember correctly. So he tied up this worker, the father, and he threw him into a ditch and then just sort of forgot about him. So it's manslaughter, really. And he died from the elements. So Euthyphro's here to basically completely dob him in and like file a massive suit against him and sentence him to execution. So obviously that really interests Socrates because of the ethical context and just the pure conviction of this guy that the sort of it's just astonishing to Socrates that somebody could do this. And what he wants to sort of unpack is a kind of moral and religious certainty that Euthyphro has, because he's like, oh, you must be an expert in piety. Well, a few weeks I'm going to be on trial for impiety, so you can teach me now what impiety is. Because in reality, this would have been so much more annoying. Like, it's so sarcastic.
He's just like, oh, you're the expert on this. Yeah. Why don't you tell me?
It's just like, oh, you can. If you know so much, you can teach me now. Go on, give me a definition of piety now. While we're standing here in this hallway. So they go through a few definitions, basically. They talk a little bit first about the Greek gods and how problematic they are. And they do sort of move away from a more conventional view of worship and piety. There's the thing that piety is interconnected in this context with justice. So that's really what they're talking about. They're sort of interchangeable. And I think that's to do with an ancient context of religion that we don't any longer have.
So to give us some idea of the religious context of going on in this sort of period, what is the sort of faith context of much of ancient Greece during this sort of 5th century?
So it's obviously polytheistic, the Greek gods, Apollo and Apollo a Greek god, or is he not?
I can't
Roman?
remember.
Fuck.
If it's a planet, it's probably a Roman god. But
right.
Well, I can't remember.
It's polytheistic.
I always get them mixed up, so don't worry.
Yeah, lots of different ones, and it's to do with kind of making offerings and providing services to the divine. And obviously Socrates has a much different idea of that divine. His is more abstract. But I think also it's worth noting that even in a conventional context, so doing these offerings and doing this, a sort of an offering and a sense of worship isn't just an act or a ritual. It's not just ritualistic entirely. It's also to do with an orientation of life. So it's also to do with behavior. So if an act is pious, it is an ethical act as well. But interestingly, there is a separation between an ethical act and a pious act. But I think what they want to get at in this conversation is, when do those two cross over? So what exactly is piety in an ethical context? Aside from laying down a reef at the temple of Zeus,
So to set the stage, I think one of the sort of problems that Socrates ended up getting down to, and the question that he sort of poses, it doesn't really get answered, but it's one of these slightly technical sort of questions. The best way I've seen this phrased, and the way I like to see it phrased, which is kind of an oversimplification, but we'll dig into it, is the pious good because it is good in and of itself, or is it just good because it is loved by the gods? And so you have this idea of like, is there a difference between what is pious? So like when we do something that is pious, are we doing that because the gods love us to do that? Or are we doing it because it's good and the gods love good things? Or, are the gods, is what pious and what is good just two technically separate categories? And or I think there's 4 or 5 different ways you can sort of pose this argument. But the idea is it's sort of teasing apart this separation between piety or holiness or acting in a holy way with acting in a good way, and saying, are they the same thing? Are they different things?
Yeah.
What do the gods think what is pious is also good, or do they have different opinions of what is good and pious? Should we act always in a good way, or do the gods have a direct communication with the good? Again, invoking the good in a more metaphysical sense.
It's pulling apart ideas that can be transposed to the Abrahamic God. So the problem with this question is why it's such an important theological question, and why apologists, people who defend religion, have been trying to answer this question for so long, is because whichever way you answer it, because there probably are only 2 ways to answer it, and if you frame the question like that, whichever way you answer it, there's a problem for God or a problem for the religious believer. So if something is good because God likes it, well, then it's just arbitrary. Then it's based on the whim of God. And you have to do a lot of, well, why is what God says good? And it's this whole circular argument. If it's the other way around, if things are good outside of God and that's why he likes them, well, then you just created something higher than God. So why bother with God? It's like, why is God even the middleman in that situation? And surely that kind of undermines the goodness, the holiness of God in some sense.
And surely that means that there will be things as well that are pious that are also not good, which would be strange.
Yes. So the way they get to this, he starts by saying, okay, my first definition of piety is exactly what I'm doing now, dobbing my dad in. And Socrates is like, well, that's an example. That's not actually a definition. Socrates loves his definitions. So he goes, okay, well, piety is pleasing the gods then. He's like, that's good, but surely that can change from God to God. And it's too relativistic, it's too vague. Actually, it's shit. So then thirdly, he's like, okay, it's what all the gods love. So what all the gods love is pious. What they all hate is impious. So he's like, well, that's good because that's sort of more universalizable. But then, yeah, this Euthyphro dilemma comes in because Socrates says, well, yeah, is something pious because the gods love it, or the gods love it because it's pious?
And the other sort of dilemma that rises as well in this text is the idea of why would the gods like some things over another? Why? And this whole dynamic of, well, if I worship the gods, why would they like me to do certain things? Because surely if they're gods, they don't need me to do anything. And then I believe Euthyphro likens it to this dynamic of like the master and the slave. Like the slave, he tries to argue that, well, the slave does things that the master needs the slave to do. But then Socrates goes, well, look, but the god wouldn't need, like, but in that case, then why would the god be needing something? Surely the god could do it themselves. They wouldn't need a slave. So the argument doesn't really help itself.
Yeah. It's interesting that a lot of these questions are packaged in what on the surface appears to be a very, really it is a ethical question. It's literally about justice. It's about something very real happening around them. They're literally standing outside a court and he's about to do this thing. So it's very interesting that even in such an early dialogue, they would be sort of equating some of these ethical ideas to something as abstract as the nature of God and goodness. And I think that's a large part of the theme in Plato's work, which is connecting ideas that to a modern audience seem very aloof and seem very abstract to very grounded, real everyday issues.
Yeah. And so I'd say that's a pretty good rough summary of Euthyphro. Do you have anything else to sort of put on any other interesting aspects of that dialogue? Or
again, it's one of these dialogues that ends in what did you call it?
Oh, it's anatreptic.
Yeah. Because basically they come full circle because he says the Euthyphro dilemma and Euthyphro is just like, what's that? I don't really understand. I don't understand the question. So he's like, well, if a box is carried, that's nothing intrinsic to the box. The box only becomes carried when you start carrying it. Like, that's nothing to do with boxness. Same with if something's loved or beloved, that only happens when it's loved. It's a quality you ascribe to something based on what's happening to it. So same with the god's love of something. So that thing, independent of the god's love, is not good. The god has to first love it for it to be good. And Euthyphro is just kind of like, well, I mean, they chat a bit and then they talk about justice in service of the gods, but then basically the dialogue comes full circle and Euthyphro just sort of shrugs and walks off.
Yeah.
And he's just like, well, I've got to go now. Sorry. And Socrates is just like, oh, well, I didn't learn anything from that. And then it ends.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Talk about some more early dialogues?
Yes, get the next one in. Are we recording?
Yeah.
Oh, fuck, okay. Right, so the next early dialogue, I'd like to bring up they're not really in any particular order, these are early ones, but let's go with Ion next. This one is one that comes up a few times, but it's essentially themed around like skill and art and, whether whether the Ion, the eponymous character in this work, really has knowledge of what he does or any skill. So to set it up, basically, Socrates is discussing art with this Homeric rhapsodist called Ion. And a rhapsodist at this time, they're sort of like the people who they're like a cover band. They like go around doing like re-impersonations of these poems. They don't write poems, they sort of go around performing poems. And he was one of Homer's sort of rhapsodists, well, he was a rhapsodist of Homer's writings.
Like when people do Shakespeare now.
Yeah. Right, yeah, he'd go around performing this stuff. And so the essential theme of it is that Socrates tries to sort of like boil this guy. And Ion is really, really arrogant. He just comes across like an absolute, a prick. He starts by asserting, he's like one of the best, rhapsodists in all of Greece, and then that he's like the number one expert on Homer, and that, he really understands Homer. And Socrates kind of goes, well, okay, well, what is it that you really have knowledge on about Homer? Like, do you really understand art, this writing? Do you really understand what's going on? And he'd be like, yeah, no, I know all this stuff about Homer. And he'd be like, well, so surely if you embody knowledge about these plays, about Homer's rhapsodies, then surely you would also know about Hesiod, if you're so sort of like, if you know all this stuff about, the poetry itself. And he goes, well, no, I don't really. But it's like, okay, so what is it that you know? Do you just know like rhapsody? Is that a skill in itself, sort of thing? And gradually it's sort of Socrates kind of just being like, this guy's really arrogant, but Socrates is kind of going up to someone who's a performing artist and going, you don't really make any art. Like, and essentially Socrates' point by the end, which is Plato kind of channeling his ideas about this sort of thing through Socrates, sort of asserts that poetic art is not an art at all, but actually just a divine gift, or this idea that a lot of this art just is a sort of divine inspiration sort of thing. Ion sort of at one point towards the end of the dialogue starts going, well, I'm also like the greatest general in Greece, and like it's just like there's nothing that apparently this guy isn't the greatest of. And Socrates is like, well, look, if you can't, well, look, Homer's poems have these things in it. Are you an expert? If you're an expert on like Homer's poems, surely you're like an expert on the things that are in like you're an expert on like fishing or whatever.
Yeah, I think he's attacking like the lowest form of a thing he really hates, which is, poetry is very controversial for Plato, and I think it goes back to that whole... there's this idea that obviously good is transcendent and that things come from a higher place, and the dislike of doxa as well, and the fact that his most favoured idea of good is a eudaimonia, and it's a kind of fulfilled goodness. But it's the same with absolutely everything that he likes.
Right, well, eudaimonia is sort of like the Greek word for a sort of flourishing or fulfillment. It's not necessarily happiness, which is probably the easiest thing you can say to someone. Eudaimonia is basically happiness. It's not, because it has all these ideas about meaning and fulfillment and flourishing as an individual sort of built into them.
Yeah. So when he's talking about the soul and the order of a person, he is striving for a kind of higher appreciation of things, and he doesn't like unchecked opinions. He doesn't like unqualified views. He likes informed expertise. So to him, like, a philosopher is actually a very rigorous thing, and he thinks that poets aren't really like that a lot of the time. He thinks that so I think this is part of why he is like laying the groundwork of Western philosophy, because he's defining what a philosopher is through these dialogues.
Yeah, so he basically going up to Ion and going, well, do you actually understand what art is? Do you understand what you're doing? Do you understand what the art you're performing is? Are you really channeling some kind of knowledge about the art, or is it some kind of divine inspiration, or is it, what is it that you're doing if you don't really have knowledge of what it is? I guess that's, the sort of fundamental theme of this. Although it does, like I said, it does kind of conclude with Socrates asserting this idea that art is this divine form of inspiration. Like most dialogues, that Ion sort of eventually concedes. The next one might just do a brief little look at Gorgias. So this one I'm not as familiar with as many of the other ones, but it's essentially Socrates having a bit of an argument with a famous rhetorician in Greece. He was one of the most famous rhetoricians in Greece at the time, one of the most well-known one, the eponymous character Gorgias, who was a sophist. And basically Socrates is debating with him and his pupil that rhetoric, although possibly giving power and persuasion, produces beliefs without actual knowledge. And so a lot of the sort of premise of this thing is this idea that these rhetoricians, who are sort of often politicians or in a way or sophists, as we've sort of mentioned before, which is almost like the entrepreneurs, the wordsmith entrepreneurs of
very relativist people that to do X to get Y, kind of they fulfill a function. They just sort of come along and be like, they're a bit like lawyers for hire sometimes. Right. Other times,
the idea is if you're better at tying someone up with words and your arguments, then that puts you in a more right position, or it gets your own way essentially. And a lot of the crux of what this piece is about is that this idea of rhetoric, while in some ways it can be useful, it can lead to people believing in arguments and manipulating arguments that aren't necessarily true because they're very good rhetoricians, but not necessarily speaking truth or serving, as Socrates would put it, a higher good, the good, And also, part of this piece is there's themes of like it's worse to do wrong than to suffer it. Again, a theme that will come back later with a lot of Plato's writings, this idea of corrupting your soul from committing wrongful actions. And essentially, a lot of it sort of concludes being about the limits of politics and philosophy in itself, not just rhetoric, the sort of limitations of what can be achieved through philosophy and politics and dialogue, and the limitations of where we can go, not just entirely through rhetoric, but through dialogue itself. And so in that way, it is an interesting little one, and you get to see the big WWE wrestling match between Socrates and Gorgias, the sophist, like big famous, who may have never met in real life. Who knows? Probably never did. Who knows? Let's chuck a little shout out to Protagoras. So. Actually, no, before we do that, let's mention that the one that we're not really going to talk about or cover very much is the lesser and the greater Hippias. One of the reasons why that is because there's a slight question mark over their origin. It's generally, I think now the consensus is they were written by Plato, or at least the lesser Hippias was written by Plato, but the fact it is pretty questionable, and also the quality of the writing of these particular dialogues is much lower than the other ones, and thus they're kind of they're swept aside, and somewhat rightly so. But essentially, the lesser one is a dialogue in which Socrates argues with a guy called Hippias, who's another sophist, about voluntary versus involuntary wrongdoing. And the greater one is a debate about the beautiful, about defining what beauty is, what is beautiful. And again, both texts of questionable authenticity. And so some people will start to group what we're sort of like putting into this category of early, but some people will call these the next sort of dialogues pre-middle dialogues, or dialogues that seem to sort of separate themselves a little bit categorically for one reason or another from these sort of earlier dialogues.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is to do with generality as well. I think as these dialogues continue, he starts to open up into more broader conversations. And like I said, Socrates starts to become more interested as a character in other things, like bigger political questions, and questions almost like about the cosmos, about the nature of God, and lots of the soul, and other
very get more metaphysics,
strange realms and things.
Yeah. But the first one, let's mention Protagoras first. So Protagoras is essentially another big sort of like Socrates versus, and in this case it is against the great sophist Protagoras, and they begin basically discussing whether virtue can be taught, and there's also themes about pleasure and whether pleasure is good and that sort of thing. And essentially, it actually starts, is another one of these like hedged dialogues where essentially starts with Socrates and an unknown companion. And he basically says, well, recounting a conversation that he'd already had with Protagoras.
They're often stories contained within stories, which is quite funny.
So the main bulk of the story is set up as Socrates recounting this dialogue he had. And then the second part sort of goes into where Socrates is going to this house of this guy called Callias, who is entertaining Protagoras at the time. It's where this dialogue takes place. And Socrates says he will go with this guy called Hippocrates, who is intending to meet with Protagoras and sort of see if he can get some tutorship from Protagoras. And Socrates kind of goes like, hang on, let me go vet this dude for you. Let me just like protect you from his sophistry, you know. So he just sort of like tags along and goes like to, you know, quote, protect this guy from Protagoras. And essentially, quite immediately, obviously, Socrates gets to business with Protagoras and basically accuses that he cannot teach what he professes, because when Protagoras sort of starts talking about how to teach politics, you need to be able to teach virtue, you need to be able to teach like bravery and courage and things like this, and wisdom and these sorts of virtues. That is something he can teach that like parents and the home environment can only teach to a certain extent. You can only embody like these, you know, teach about what these sort of virtues are a little bit, and then his role is to come into this young man's life and teach them really, you know, the real knowledge and the path of what these real virtues are. And to a certain extent, he sort of like believes that he can aspire to a sort of higher thing than he necessarily can. And Socrates starts by quizzing Protagoras on whether he even knows what virtue is. He just basically goes, well, what is virtue? You know, the classic Socrates one-liner, someone says something and he goes, well, what is that? and basically they go into this dialogue about how can he be good if he doesn't know what virtue is? And Protagoras is also one of these guys who pretends, you know, he believes that sophistry should be like rules. He believes that like these, you know, these sophists and these people, these wordsmiths.
Just taking a step back a second, why do you think Socrates or Plato or whoever really cares about this? Why is he interested in asking questions like this to people? Why does he care if he can define virtue or not?
Because I think a lot of this is, again, sort of Plato targeting a sophist or targeting someone who maybe is pretending or lying about knowing more than they potentially know. And again, hammering home that idea that a lot of this is probably not knowledge that they actually have, or trying to expose that sort of ignorance. And in many cases, just trying to boil down a definition of a particular thing. In this dialogue, that thing is talking about things like virtue and...
I think it actually seems to change, because some of them he appears quite confrontational and somewhat rude, but in others I think he's genuinely trying to work with somebody,
right?
Because he compares it to sort of midwifery. He compares it to like he's like healing their soul almost, by trying to teach them things that they already know.
Right. And I think one of the things that I've sort of noticed is it's definitely the ones where he is more sort of antagonistic towards the people is normally when they are a sophist, or when they are someone who is this figure who is aspiring, you know, is like maybe a politician or something.
It's almost like they don't even claim to represent anything. I think that's what angers him slightly more.
Right. Or, you know, when they're clearly not people they necessarily would have liked, or Plato would have liked. It's unclear, but you can tell there's certain people he definitely paints in a much more negative light, and has Socrates kind of go in pretty hard on them.
I think it's trying to establish standards and genuinely learn from some people. But yeah, in other cases, I think it's a bit more of an assault.
Yeah, in other cases,
but possibly justified.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, they are all about sort of like teaching something or learning something. There's also some theme or message going through them. It's just, necessarily the sort of surface level aspect of the dialogue for however much you can read into, whether it's, you know, Socrates trying to be, more aggressive than normal or whatever, or trying to be more reductionist than normal, that's a different case. And obviously there's some of them in which he merely questions, and some of them in which he does put forward alternative definitions and things, and sort of has more of a back and forth with his interlocutor, where he talks about, okay, well, here's my idea of what this is, and then the interlocutor has a chance to actually debate whether Socrates' idea of this particular thing is correct or not.
Yeah, like I said, I think a lot of the reason why he doesn't often actually provide an answer is because Plato wants you as the reader to discern what he's thinking through this conversation, or he wants you to come to your own conclusion through witnessing, in many ways, a real conversation. But I think also part of that sort of vague, speculative, playful stuff, which is really unique to Plato. Like I said, no one else writes in dialogues, and it's like most people would write a treatise or something, and they would be very direct about what they say. I can only think of I think Nietzsche, and there's a few that write in sort of very strange ways, very deliberately vague ways. Most writers, though, are very direct. And I think there are very good kind of thematic reasons for that, why he chooses not to sort of show his hand a lot of the time.
Yeah. Anyway, so this dialogue sort of concludes with, the slam dunk from Socrates is that Protagoras is sort of proclaiming, attesting to sort of all these different virtues, this is the virtue and this is the virtue. And Socrates eventually sort of argues him down to accepting that all virtues ultimately condense down to wisdom. This idea that you would have wisdom of what virtues are. So you eventually trickle down to wisdom. And that's sort of where he gets the slam dunk. But interestingly enough, this is actually a case where Socrates is a liar. And this is one of the few cases where he tells a porky, because like I mentioned before, this is like a nested narrative about where he's recounting the story of him talking to Protagoras with this random person. But guess what? What he's talking about there actually happened earlier on the day. So the whole narrative is nested within him saying to some random person, oh yeah, earlier today I was talking to blah, blah, blah. But at the end of this particular dialogue, he says to Protagoras, I've got some really important stuff to do. I'm off now, bye. And then clearly, if we are to believe this story, essentially he goes, oh, I've got some really important stuff. I've got to go do something else. Sorry, Protagoras. Walks out the door and just immediately starts talking to some random bloke about everything he just said. So clearly he didn't have anything important to do.
Maybe it is important.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe the idea there is that the whole point is that it's important, or probably more likely it sort of shows that maybe some of Socrates' methods weren't entirely on face value honest in necessarily everything he would say. Yeah, and so sort of moving on from Protagoras through these sort of pre-middle dialogues, I guess. The next one I sort of have to mention is Laches. Now, Laches is one that is essentially exploring, again, virtue, or arete, as it's called, with a couple of generals. One, the eponymous Laches, and a guy called Nicias. The former having actually led Socrates at a battle, and they begin to define this idea of what courage is, and that's sort of where the dialogue sort of takes place. And Laches says that courage is about sort of not running away, and Socrates basically goes, nah, that's not right. Presses the button, and then Nicias says, oh, well, what about, knowing what to fight for? Then Socrates goes, no. And then deconstructs why it's, for the not running away, he gives the example, well, sometimes, you need to sort of, there can be examples of courage where you need to run away, and there can be examples of courage without knowing what to fight for. And ultimately, the generals sort of admit they don't actually know really what courage means. They kind of just oh, okay, Socrates, all right, we don't really get what courage is, fair enough. And basically, I think
get out of my house, for fuck's sake, stop annoying me.
Well, funny enough, this one seems a little bit more cordial, perhaps because of the the history that Socrates has with these men. But essentially, they sort of courageously admit to not knowing what courage is, and also.
Well, I think that admission is part of what Socrates is after. But I also think that Plato wants to end these dialogues deliberately open-ended a lot of the time because philosophy is eternal. Like the conversation is eternal. If he had fixed answers on everything, he'd by his own sort of way of thinking, he'd be a twat. Like,
yeah. Although the end of this is pretty, he's being a pretty bad. Like, I mean, I think the context of this conversation is the generals are talking. They're asking Socrates, "Oh, who should we get for like tutors for our kids? You know, like who should we get? Who are good? You know, who should we recommend for?" Who should we get to teach them and all that sort of thing. And by the end of the conversation, Socrates basically tells the generals that they must seek a teacher for themselves before seeking one for their sons, which is great. They're just going, no, you need to be taught something first. And in a way, it does kind of illustrate, like you just mentioned, it illustrates partly why this kind of like Socrates, partly why he got executed. Like to basically these members of authority, he's very, acerbic and just not particularly, doesn't sugarcoat his words.
No, it's that sort of, there's a truth, there's a sort of raw truth, but it's almost like those people that go like, oh, you get what you get with me. I won't bloody lie to anyone. I'll call everyone a cunt. That dickhead it's just like who has no tact, who will just call everybody a cunt to their face for absolutely no reason. It's like,
the distinction is with a Socrates character is it's like they often sort of make up for it with this extreme competence, or they have a point to make. It's like they have an important thing to point to make that they're sort of campaigning for. That sort of, from the outsider perspective, makes it justifiable. Although, obviously, living without the tact, as we well know historically, does come with its burden to bear. And so the next one that's sort of another similar sounding one, Lysis, is a little dialogue on friendship. And essentially the theme of it is is Socrates in a dialogue basically figuring out what friendship actually means, what it is. And this is another anatreptic one. This is one where there's no real answer, where they just sort of like play around with different definitions of what it means to be a friend for someone. What does it mean to be a friend? But never really settling on a definition that they can wholeheartedly agree on or is free of criticism. And it's most of the dialogue, I mean, it starts off with this guy called Hypothalamus, who's in love with this guy called Lysis, and sort of explores that. But
that's another thing to mention. Plato was he was big on the sausage.
Yeah. Well, they all were, mate. They all.
Yeah. But I mean, like Plato especially, I think obviously I don't think he married or had any children or anything, and I think he's a big bum boy.
Yeah, to put it tactly, and. Well, I mean, friendship in the Greek word is like philia, as you may have seen borrowed over for a lot of random English sort of suffixes, like hydrophilic or something. And the question basically is the dialogue sort of takes place between Socrates and these two young friends called Lysis and Menexus. Menexus. There we go, Menexus. And essentially, he's inquired after for advice on love by these two young youths, and his first conversation essentially asks, like, he's not being nice. He kind of just goes, well, okay, so you two are friends. Like, let's break this down then. Okay, so Lysis, your parents love you. So, why, but if you can't give me a definition for like what love is or friendship is, why should they love you? If you're useless, why should your parents love you? It's just literally like that. And then Lysis is like, Lysis can't really come up with anything, but now he's worried that his friend, Menexus, is going to like think of him as less of a friend because he's made to look bad in front of Socrates. So Lysis goes, can you Socrates, can you please like own him as well, so we're on equal footing, so we both feel bad.
Yeah.
And then Socrates moves on to him, and then basically goes down this route of Socrates says that a good friend is what he values the most, but he doesn't actually have one or know how they come to be. He's just like, I don't have any friends, so come on then. How do you get friends then, Menexus? And
I think a lot of this is irony. Yeah, it's like
Yeah, this definitely has some amount of ironic tone. Of course, the way I'm telling it is a little bit comedic.
Yeah.
This isn't directly how it sort of this is the spirit of it, I suppose, but in a slightly more serious dialogue form. And yeah, Lysis goes on to defend the friendship he has, and basically tries to describe, and they go down different routes. Like they try to describe like friendship as being like a like for like thing, like where two goods sort of attract together to become friends. But then they're like, well, no, that can't be right, because why would like two bad, a bad and a bad or something like that automatically want to become friends? That doesn't really make sense. So they kind of abandon that definition. And again, they just try to define it, like Menexus tries to define it with need. That goes, well, there's some kind of mutual need relationship there, and some kind of reciprocity. But Socrates reduces this to the idea that all friendships are simply instrumental, so they're all just like everyone just needs someone because they need something out of that person or something. And so they go, well, okay, well maybe it's not that. And the dialogue is inconclusive. So there's no real, like, they sort of hit a lot of what false positives, so to speak, when it comes to definition, and they also hit a lot of false negatives. They hit things that maybe wouldn't work, don't really fit into what a friendship might mean to most people, and they hit on stuff that could mean some things, but not in all contexts. And essentially, that's what the dialogue is exploring and sort of going through.
Yeah, I think a lot of those themes are picked up later in Symposium and dealt with in a much more substantial and arguably satisfying way.
Yeah.
A lot of that stuff to do with friendship, and also how friendship connects with love, because obviously they're not talking about women in this. Although Plato is slightly more progressive than a lot of his contemporaries in terms of that kind of stuff. Like he was happy to teach women and thought that women should be taught. I guess we can talk more about that when we talk about the academy.
Yeah.
But it's very interconnected with ideas of intellectual fulfillment between males, and there's sort of like sexual elements crossed over with sort of this idea of betterment of the soul, betterment of acquiring virtues. I think is a large part of. He's always up for people improving themselves, society improving themselves. He wants to sort of, as far as we can infer, go out and get that happening in the world. But yeah, just some of the tact with it is a little bit off.
Yeah. So the last pre-middle dialogue that we're going to cover, I'll just sort of mention to sort of tie this little first period of this 12-year traveling and writing, probably kind of maybe Plato period, is Charmedies. And is once again another anatraptic work. So it's another one that he doesn't hammer home any kind of point or particularly get anywhere with it. But this one is about exploring the meaning of temperance or self-control. And it actually features one of his uncles. Well, his uncle is Charmedies, and also a guy called Critias, who are actually associated with the 30 Tyrants, which we've just mentioned.
It's quite funny because he's a boy who would grow up to be a tyrant. He's talking about moderation too, and self-control and know thyself. And so I think that's where a large part of the context is sort of missed. Again, like if you're going to read these, it's probably worth, because a lot of them are worth reading. Most definitely, they're, even if you're not like that into philosophy, I think they're entertaining. But you do have to know who's who to get the best out of it.
Historical context, does help a lot with trying to figure out, okay, who are these people? Why are they in this dialogue? And why is the tone of the dialogue what it is? Does the actual why are these characters relevant to what's being talked about? And you find out obviously that's to do with their history that ends up happening. So this one's on temperance. I wrote like a little just like a few notes on it, but it's basically just like so Charmedies is like asked, okay, by Socrates, okay, how do you define temperance? He does this classic thing. Okay, well, what is temperance then? All right, Charmedies goes, well, okay, well, let's, how about conducts themselves in a quiet and orderly way? If we conduct ourselves in a quiet and orderly way, that is what temperance is. And Socrates goes, nah. Because, sometimes you need to run. Sometimes you need to, like, if you want to go for a run, you need to go run somewhere. It's that's obviously like, defeats the whole idea. So it must always be good. If it's a virtue, it must always be good. So we can't have running in that criteria. And so Charmedies go, right, okay, look, let's try modesty and restraint. How's that? And Socrates goes and just quotes Homer. He just basically goes, well, modesty or a sense of shame is not good for a needy man. So it's like, okay, all right. So how about doing one's own job then? How about that? Well, doing your job. And Socrates says, well, if this is about doing your own business, then what about people in service? What about people who are like a lawyer or just anyone in a service job? And somebody's all right, okay. Like, how about maybe you just have to know when you're like temperate, when you've got that temperance. And Socrates sort of says, well, but you said you don't know what temperance is. So if you don't know what temperance is, then how do you, how can you ever be temperate? And so Charmedies tries self-knowledge. How about that? And Socrates sort of ends kind of with, well, temperance is knowledge of itself. And this idea of sort of temperance being this thing that's kind of almost like a degree, a sort of self-awareness. And that's kind of where it kind of like rests is as far as that dialogue is concerned. Exploring this definition of temperance could, again, another one where essentially what they're doing is trying to unpack this particular virtue, this particular word that means something good or is considered something good. But they want to be able to nail down what it is to act in that way.
I think one thing that's particularly striking when you read all of these is that they're not particularly difficult. I think some people have this impression of philosophy, particularly like, I guess, later analytic philosophy, that it's full of very difficult concepts and it's full of lots of heavy jargon. But apart from the historical context, and I think you do have to sort of read between the lines a lot of the time and be careful not to oversimplify and overgeneralize, especially with some of the more substantial books especially towards his later dialogues and things.
Right, it's worth mentioning that was not a line for line rereading of the Charmedies. That was definitely me making it a very casual, very watered down chat.
Of course,
but it is. They are like much more involved and much more descriptive, but you get the idea of like this idea of this back and forth. But they're not. They're more. The language can be denser than that, but it's still a conversation between two people. And a lot of the problems that they're facing, a lot of the things they're thinking about, are not far removed from. They're not.
Yeah,
temperance is still a thing that we could think about and try to define today. We can.
It's not Heidegger talking about being or like Bergson talking about time. It's not to that degree. And I think so long as you know the historical context, you can follow these conversations and largely understand them. Because there's some books, I think, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, the Kant book, like that's just so dense. It's to a lot of people, it's actually quite impenetrable. But yeah, I think there's this sense that Plato's kind of getting through some of the questions here, and the rest of philosophy is trying to figure out answers to these questions.
Right, and he doesn't become until the next installment of Two Beers Till Phronesis Plato. So far it's been, it's pretty sort of focused around virtue and a bit of sort of like, piety and religion and the good and things like this in these early dialogues. You get a sense of, like you said, the way it's sort of written is less, Socrates is not really necessarily going on about all these different ideas and novel concepts. A lot of it is just simply exploring this landscape of doubt in which a lot of this stuff exists. So to sort of wrap up this particular segment, I want to sort of go what happened to Plato sort of next. So he gone for his travels. He'd written these works sometime during this period. And then in around sort of, I think it was like 387 BC, I think it was. Let me just double check. Yeah, so 387 BC.
Before we do the Academy, can we actually we talk through his influences?
Sure, can do that. So, I mean, aside from like Socrates, as far as like his major influence is concerned, there's definitely Pythagoras is certainly in there. I mean, we'll get more into that in the next one because he sort of goes, he supposedly studies a bit under the Pythagoreans for a while in Italy. But as far as pre-Socratics are concerned, like you have, people like Heraclitus and Anaxagoras, the ceaseless change and everything is a division of a more fundamental thing was kind of like this, was kind of like the idea that was originally kind of established, and Plato kind of took this sort of everything is reduced to a fundamental thing and flipped it into a more metaphysical idea of, again, this is going to be more of a second part thing, to be honest.
Yeah, so for now, we'll just say,
yeah.
Heraclitus was the guy we talked about in the first episode, the guy who thought that everything is in flux, the world's made of fire. And I think this thing about the world being in flux influenced a lot of Plato's skepticism, which is obviously embodied through Socrates. And a few things about the material world and the fickleness of people's views and how quick they can change. I think that's something that's carried over from Heraclitus. And with Parmenides, obviously, his whole thing was that things are eternal. And I think a lot of that Plato was looking into. And this, I think this is like kind of the second part thing, that it's this idea that there are certain things that are eternal and immaterial and ceaseless and never changing. And that's very important to the development of Plato's ideas.
Right. With Parmenides, it was this sort of like metaphysical unity is the sort of umbrella I put it under, where it's this idea that you have some oneness to all things, and all things are just a manifestation of some underlying things.
Yeah.
And I mean, Zeno also probably bummed Plato, so there you go. Zeno was a student of Parmenides. But yeah, I mean, so Plato around 387 BC returns to Athens, and this is where one of his other major claims to fame, if he didn't need another one, comes from. It's where he founded the Academy. And the Academy was basically this educational institution in which essentially people would go in and
It's the world's first uni.
Yeah, essentially. It's where the word academic comes from. The Socratic method was used and taken very seriously. Geometry was taken very seriously. I mean, the inscription above, translated into English, was "Let none but geometers enter here."
Yeah, it's very disputed, but yeah, the maths things. He thought that you should obviously learn a lot of fucking maths before you go anywhere near philosophy. Again, this whole idea of trying to remedy doxa and remedy kind of unqualified thinking. He likes expertise. He likes informed expertise. But it's worth noting that the Academy itself actually had a very functional use. He was not just training people to think, he was training people to be statesmen in a lot of cases. And a lot of very influential and useful kind of people went through the Academy.
Not least Aristotle himself.
Yep.
Who we'll get to at a later time. So in the next episode, we're going to be discussing his sort of middle period and getting more into more of his serious works and the next sort of stage of his life and where he sort of went after these kind of early works. And now we've sort of established who he is. But yeah, all the beans. Yeah,